The air in Quebec, that September of 1944, did not carry the freshness of the Canadian autumn. It smelled of lead ahead and a vengeance brewing in absolute silence, while Allied armies tore through the borders of the Reich. The fate of 80 million souls was not being decided in muddy trenches, but in oak-paneled rooms, under the smoke of expensive cigars and the clinking of crystal. A pen rested in the hands of Henry Morgenthau Jr., and it was not loaded with ink, but with the acid of retribution. The Morgenthau Plan was not a military strategy. It was a geographical exorcism. The idea was simple in its brutality: to transform the industrial heart of Europe into a vast pasture, to dismantle every gear, every furnace in Essen, every mine in the Ruhr, until Germany was nothing more than a patchwork of peasants, bent over the earth, unable to forge even a nail for a horseshoe, let alone a tiger tank. It was the castration of a nation through total deindustrialization. The weight of every typed word on those pages was palpable. Churchill initially hesitated. The old lion roared about how it would be like shackling a corpse to the British economy. But American gold spoke louder than imperial morality. Roosevelt, his face marked by the exhaustion of a war that was stealing his life, looked at the map and saw, not borders, but a wound that needed to be cauterized. They wanted Germany to never again breathe the steam of factories. They wanted the silence of the machines. What was being drawn there was a map of shadows. The Saar would be annexed, East Prussia carved up, and what remained would be divided into two autonomous states, North and South, separated by an international zone that was, in truth, an industrial cemetery. There was no room for reconstruction. The concept of reparation had been replaced by eradication. If the German people starved under the sun of their new potato fields, that was a price Morgenthau was willing to let others pay. History is a living organism, but it is fed by the memory of those who refuse to close their eyes. Forgetfulness is the second death of a civilization. And what happened in those rooms in Quebec nearly erased the future of an entire continent, for this record not to be lost in the vacuum of centuries. And so the light of truth continues to illuminate the basements of power. I ask that you mark your presence in this record, prevent time from erasing this account, ensure that this chronicle finds fertile ground, inscribing your consciousness in our constant vigil. Paper was never a good guardian of secrets, especially when it is soaked in poison. In mid-September 1944, what should have been a whisper between geopolitical gods became a scream in American headlines. The Wall Street Journal and the New York Times revealed the guts of the Morgenthau Plan, and the effect was like throwing a lit match into a powder keg. But the most devastating fire did not occur in Washington. It occurred through the loudspeakers of Berlin. Joseph Goebbels, the architect of lies, received the plan as a dark gift sent by fate itself. He no longer needed to invent monsters. The Allies had drawn one for him. Nazi rhetoric, which was beginning to falter under the weight of defeats in the East, found a new and terrible breath. Germany will be transformed into a vast potato field, the radio screamed. They want to enslave your children and turn your daughters into servants of the land. The Morgenthau Plan became the Jewish extermination plan in the mouth of German propaganda. Fear, that cold and efficient engine, was injected into the veins of every Wehrmacht soldier and every teenager in the Hitler Youth. If the fate was total annihilation and perpetual hunger under a plow, it was better to die burning the world around them. The resistance in cities like Aachen and, later, in the Hürtgen forest, gained a suicidal ferocity. Men who had already lost hope in victory began to fight for the simple right of not being erased from history as an agricultural footnote. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the State Department in Washington, the panic was palpable. Cordell Hull and Henry Stimson, secretaries who still believed in the reconstruction of a stable Europe, looked at Morgenthau with the horror of someone watching a surgeon amputate the heart instead of the gangrenous limb. They knew that a German reduced to pasturage would not just be an economic vacuum, but an invitation for the red specter of Stalin to advance unhindered to the Rhine. The tension was electric. Roosevelt, already debilitated, felt the pressure from his own advisors. The plan that seemed like poetic justice in Quebec was turning into a logistical and moral nightmare. How to feed millions of people in a country whose fertilizer plants had been imploded and whose coal mines were flooded. Morgenthau's response was an icy silence. The survival of the German people was not an American responsibility. The front lines hardened. The blood that flowed in that autumn of 1944 had a different taste. It was the blood of absolute despair. Every meter of German soil was defended as if it were the last trench of civilization, because, for them, the Morgenthau Plan meant there would be no after. Morgenthau's map was not just paper and ink. It was the shovel digging a nation's grave. And the condemned decided they would not go into it without taking their executioners with them. The winter of 1944 brought more than just ice over the Ardennes. It brought the chilling realization that vengeance is a luxury survivors can rarely afford. As American troops advanced through the ruins of cities, there were nothing more than skeletons of limestone and twisted iron. Directive JCS 1067, the bureaucratic soul of the Morgenthau Plan, began to dictate the rhythm of the occupation. It was a cold order, Military governors were not to take a single step toward economic rehabilitation. The instruction was clear. Germany was not to be rebuilt. It was to be kept in a state of controlled penury. I saw men of steel, generals who had crossed oceans to crush fascism. Look at German children, scavenging through trash cans for potato peels, and feel the weight of a victory that was beginning to taste like ashes. The non-fraternization policy attempted to block human contact, but hunger ignores military edicts. Morgenthau's plan to pastoralize the Reich was happening in practice, but not as an agrarian utopia, rather as a nightmare of malnutrition and disease. The Rhine, once the pulsing artery of European industry, ran grey and silent, while the remaining machines were dismantled and sent east as trophies of war. Yet while the factories were being imploded, a new shadow projected itself from the Orient. Joseph Stalin didn't just want pastures, he wanted the vacuum. For the man of iron in the Kremlin, a deindustrialized and starving Germany was the perfect breeding ground for communism. Hunger is the best ally of revolution. And it was there, between the rubble of Berlin and the conference rooms of Potsdam, that the Morgenthau Plan began to collide with the reality of Western survival. If Germany were transformed into an agricultural cemetery, who would stop the red tide from flooding the rest of an exhausted continent? The tension between Morgenthau and Secretary of State Stimson became a trench war within the White House. Stimson argued that you cannot punish an entire people without transforming yourself into a monster. He saw what Morgenthau refused to see, that Europe was a single organism. If you tore out the industrial lungs of Germany, the rest of the European body would die of economic asphyxiation. American charity could not sustain an entire continent in a vegetative state forever. The morality of war is a tightrope stretched over an abyss. On one side, the legitimate desire to ensure that German soil would never again produce a cannon. On the other, the understanding that absolute misery is the cradle of even worse tyrants. The dilemma was no longer about what Germany deserved for the concentration camps, had shown the world what industrialized hatred was capable of, but about what the world could endure to maintain its own sanity. Faced with this landscape of ruins and impossible dilemmas, I ask you, who observe these fragments of time? How far should justice go before it transforms into the very evil it swore to combat? Is it possible to heal the world through the hunger of a nation, or is vengeance merely the prelude to a new fall? Leave your reflection upon this wall of time. Your voice is the proof that history is not just about the past, but about the mirror it holds before us. The death of Roosevelt in April 1945 did more than bury a leader. It entombed the political protection Morgenthau enjoyed. With Harry Truman taking the helm in a world smelling of gunpowder and decay, Missouri pragmatism began to erode the ideology of revenge. Truman looked at Europe and saw not a map to be carved up, but a chessboard where the king was under attack. A shadow of the Iron Curtain, described by Churchill with the precision of a prophet, was no longer a metaphor, it was a wall of steel advancing. The Morgenthau Plan began to die in the sordid details of logistics. In the winter of 1946 to 1947, Germany became a black hole of resources. The United States Army, instead of being a victorious occupying force, was transformed into a social welfare agency of colossal proportions. Keeping Germany as a pasture meant that American taxpayers would have to send ships loaded with grain to feed a population that had been forbidden from producing its own sustenance. Pastoralization was an equation that simply didn't balance. Herbert Hoover, sent by Truman to assess the situation, wrote a report that sounded like a coup de grace to Morgenthau's ambitions. He was blunt. You can keep Germany as a pasture, but you will have to exterminate or export 25 million people for it to work. The physical reality of hunger surpassed the political theory of punishment. Europe was dying of cold and starvation because its central furnace had been extinguished by decree. It was then that General George Marshall took the definitive step away from the abyss of the Cold War. The Marshall Plan was, in essence, the antidote to Morgenthau's poison. Instead of dismantling factories, the United States began sending dollars to rebuild them. Instead of turning engineers into peasants, they turned them into allies against the Soviet advance. The logic had shifted. A prosperous Germany was now the first line of defense against communism. The ashes of Morgenthau became the concrete of a new Western Europe. Henry Morgenthau Jr. resigned, watching his dream of a disarmed and agrarian Germany be replaced by the roar of Volkswagen factories and the Siemens turbines coming back to life. He left with the bitterness of one who believed the world was committing the same mistake of 1918. But the world was too busy trying not to freeze in a nuclear conflict to heed his warnings. Morgenthau's map was filed away in leather folders, becoming a ghost of what might have been. A continent of peasants watched over by foreign armies, an open wound that would never heal. History, in its cruelest irony, often buries its monsters not under the earth, but under mountains of new problems. The Morgenthau Plan was not defeated by compassion, but by convenience. The map that intended to turn steel into plows was replaced by the diagram of power blocks, and Germany, which should have been a silent potato field, became the epicenter of a tug of war that would last half a century. Today, when we walk the streets of Frankfurt or observe the chimneys of the Ruhr, It is hard to imagine there was a moment when all of it was meant to disappear. Henry Morgenthau's plan remains as a dark reminder of how close we came to a Carthaginian solution, the total destruction of the enemy to ensure they would never rise again. Had the plan been executed to the end, the Europe we know would be nothing more than an agrarian patchwork, vulnerable and stripped of its industrial soul, but the invisible scars remained. The Morgenthau Plan left a mark on the German psyche, an ancestral fear of annihilation that fueled the economic miracle with the energy of one running to escape the abyss. Vengeance, when denied, transforms into an obsession with proving oneself indispensable. Germany rebuilt itself not just to survive, but so that no one could ever again suggest the world would be better off without the sound of its machines. Morgenthau's map now rests in dusty archives, a historical curiosity for scholars, but its spirit still whispers whenever justice and retribution clash. It taught us that peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of a future. Punishing the past at the expense of tomorrow is a debt no nation can pay. The silence of German factories would have been the sound of a continent dying. Instead, the world chose the deafening noise of progress, however dangerous it might be. The ashes and the memory remain. I am but the chronicler who saw Morgenthau's pen hover over the map and felt the tremor of a future that almost did exist. My account ends here, but the vigil for truth is eternal. This record is a historical duty, a way to ensure the shadows of the past do not become the darkness of our future. If you feel this testimony deserves to be preserved, share it. Make this account a torch passed from hand to hand, so that memory does not fade. Leave your support as a sign that you understand the weight of this legacy.